The time configuration dialog allows us to choose the range of time displayed in the track bar or timeline. That range of time is also known as the active time segment. The time configuration dialog also determines the display conventions for units of time, whether that's frames, seconds, or timecode. Open Time Configuration from the button at the bottom of the interface. The active time segment is set in the Animation section here. The first thing that's kind of unorthodox is that the start time is frame 0 by default. In many programs, animation starts from frame 1, but Max defaults to a start time of frame 0. And this actually makes a lot of sense from the perspective of a production environment which uses timecode. Each second of timecode starts on frame 0, and so does the default 3ds Max start time. If we want to view the timeline in seconds and frames, then the start time of frame 0 starts to make a lot of sense. We can go up into the time display section and switch that over to SMPTE, or Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. Now we get timecode numbers displayed in the animation time fields. And as is typical with some of these very old features of 3ds Max, it's actually not technically correct. SMPTE timecode always uses leading zeros. So the start time here really should say 0:00:00. But it doesn't. It's missing those leading zeros. But let's not get too pedantic here. The point is that the beginning of this animation clip will start on the first frame of a timecode second. And that first frame is always labeled 0. For 30 frames per second timecode, the first frame is labeled 0. The last frame is labeled 29, and each frame is 1/30th of a second. Let's say we wanted 5 seconds of animation, and without thinking about it too deeply, we might enter a value in the end time down here of 5 seconds and 0 frames, and press enter. Now what we have here is actually 5 seconds of animation plus 1 frame, because we're stopping on the first frame of second number 5. And we're actually going to include that last frame within our clip. In the frame count field over here, we see that the clip duration is 5 seconds and 1 frame. And this is the relevant field that tells us the actual length of our animation. The length field above it here is completely bogus, and I would block that out of your mind if possible, and just pretend it doesn't exist because it makes no sense. It's merely the end time minus the start time, but that does not give us any useful information. If I wanted exactly 5 seconds of animation, I could either start on frame 1, or I could end on frame 4 seconds and 29 frames. Let's do it by starting on frame 1. I'll just click on the little up arrow on the spinner and set the start time to 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and 1 frame. And now with the end time of 5 seconds and 1 frame, we have a duration of exactly 5 seconds. Or I could use the SMPTE conventions and start on frame 0. In that case, I would want to set the end time to 4:29. And now we're at an exact frame count or duration of 5 seconds, 0 frames. All right, so that's if you want to use SMPTE or timecode. If you want to use just ordinary frames, of course, you can do that. You can go back to frames in the time display. And now my last frame, or the end time, is frame 149. But I have a total of 150 frames of animation. All right, that's the time configuration dialog. I'll click OK to close that. After changing settings in the time configuration, sometimes you may notice that the track bar does not update. In this case, I'm still seeing SMPTE timecode. We can refresh the track bar by simply dragging on the time slider. If we want to change the length of the track bar timeline, or the active time segment, without going into that time configuration dialog, there are some keyboard and mouse shortcuts for that. To change the start time, hold down Control and Alt and drag with the left mouse button in the timeline. And you can see a little tooltip displaying the new start time. Notice that we can actually go into negative numbers. If we scroll over here, we can go into time before frame 0. And that can come in really handy in some situations, such as a dynamic simulation that needs a run-up time, or maybe if we have a character, we can set a neutral start pose, also known as a skin pose. The common practice for that is to use frame 0 for the skin pose and begin the actual animation on frame 1. But if you're using timecode conventions, you'll want the animation to start on frame 0. In that case, you can use frame -1 for the skin pose and start the animation on frame 0. All right, I'll set that back to starting on frame 0 with Control, Alt, and the left mouse button, and drag over until that tooltip says Start Time 0. To change the end time for the trackbar, hold down Control and Alt and drag with the right mouse button, and that will change the end time. To shift the entire time range, keeping the same animation duration, but moving the start and end times by the same amount, hold down Control and Alt and drag with the middle mouse button, and we can shift our entire time range that way. All right, just to make sure that I get everything back the way I want it, I can go back into time configuration. I'll set my start time to frame 0 and my end time to frame 149. And that's how to set the visible frame range of the trackbar or timeline, also known as the active time segment.